It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, fellow Quillers, to another episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. This is an exciting episode today. There's love in the air as we record this episode on this fine February morning of 2021. We want to remind you that the Don't Quill the Messenger podcast series is brought to you by the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org, your source and resource for all things Shakespeare authorship question. Before I introduce our return guest, she is a return guest. You have heard her before if you are a loyal Quiller. But before we introduce our guest, I did want to point out that the month of February, here's a rabbit hole for everybody. The month of February gets its name from the word februa, which is a strip of leather, a strip of goat hide that was used to whip women with during the Lupercalia festival of Rome. And that was the original Valentine's Day in the Roman holidays. It was a fertility festival. It is mentioned in the Shakespeare canon. In fact, it is at the Lupercalia that the play Julius Caesar first begins. And you'll notice in the text, Caesar says to Antony, don't forget that as you run by Calpurnia, make sure you strike her, because it was believed that if women were struck with these strips of leather, that it would increase their fertility, and Calpurnia was sterile and not able to give Caesar any children, which is why he adopted Octavius, who later becomes Augustus Caesar. So there's some rabbit hole information for you. Isn't it interesting that we have an entire month that is named after beating women? Take that into your account as you think about this Valentine's Day episode that we are about to record with our special guest, Dorothea Dickerman, who has been on the program before. You know, she started asking questions about Will of Stratford when she was 10 years old. Kind of like my kids, who are already being indoctrinated into this. After graduating from Amherst College summa cum laude in English and political science, and from the University of Chicago Law School, Dorothea structured billions of dollars of commercial real estate deals as a partner in a 1,000-lawyer firm for more than 3 decades. She retired from law now, and she is researching and writing on the life of Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, to answer her 10-year-old childhood question. Today, for Valentine's Day, Dorothea joins us again to talk about the real Shakespeare in love, the women who were the romantic loves of his life, and where his Valentines to them can appear in the Shakespearean canon. Welcome back, Dorothea.
Thank you, Stephen, and happy Valentine's Day to everybody.
What an exciting topic. You know, I happen to believe that our writer is one of the early feminists, and I think that comes through very strongly in many of the characters in the canon, from even, you know, the youngest of females, such as the 13-year-old Juliet, who stands up to her father, all the way through to the greatest characters in the female canon. You know, Rosalind, for instance, is the largest female role, and what a interesting and triumphant role she is from a feminist lens. All the way through Cleopatra, of course, you know, who I believe is, and not to steal some of your thunder, but probably a Valentine to the Queen.
No,
herself.
Clearly.
But we're going to talk about the loves of Edward de Vere and how they show up in the canon, where they show up in the canon, which female roles are most likely fashioned after some of these women who were the loves of Edward's life, and really dive into that autobiographical nature of the plays, which so many of our fellow Quillers and listeners have commented about that they'd like to learn more about. So here we are. We have to, I would think, start with love number one.
Yeah, well, there are 4, 2 wives and 2 lovers, and he had 7 children by them. You know, sometimes, Stephen, you fall in love with the wrong person for you. It doesn't make them a bad person. They're just not your person. And in Oxford's case, he got 3 wrong women in a row. And then the right person comes along and he or she can make all the difference for you. So, starting with...
I have been there. I have done that. I have lived that life, I can tell you.
Yeah, I think we all have. We can all relate to that. So just to review who these women are going to be, and then we'll take them one by one and go very deeply into them. Anne Cecil, his first wife. I believe she was raped by another man while she was married to Oxford, and that at first he blames her for dishonoring him as her husband. And it takes him years to realize that he was wrong to blame her, and perhaps he doesn't fully understand how wrong he was until after her death. And that is why he resurrects her and her reputation in these characters that we know. She becomes his hero. She becomes a mother that reunites with her daughter as Thesia. We'll talk about that. Queen
Fantastic.
Elizabeth. Pardon?
Now, would you put them in that order? Would you say that Anne Cecil was the first love, or would you say that Queen Elizabeth was the first love?
I'm taking them chronologically because they do overlap, and you need to see the overlaps to understand how they fit into his life. So since he marries Anne at 21, we'll talk about her first. And then there's Queen Elizabeth, who ransacks his inheritance, seduces him, and continually tries to control him. And she is the most powerful person in England for 44 years. And then there's Anne Vavasor, whom he falls madly, passionately in love with, who betrays him after she delivers an illegitimate son. And finally, after these 3, difficult romantic relationships, he finally trusts and falls in love with the woman who has everything he always wanted and needed. And Elizabeth Trenton makes all the difference. So,
isn't it interesting? He only falls in love with women named Anne and Elizabeth.
That's true. It makes it easy. Maybe
he goes Anne, Elizabeth, Anne, Elizabeth. Follow the pattern here. Anne and Elizabeth, Anne and Elizabeth. There must be some Edward de Vere in me because my wife's name is Annie Elizabeth.
Well, there you go. There you go. Maybe that's why you've been attracted to learning the truth about Shakespeare.
Oh, am I reincarnated? I got a little bit of Eddie in me somewhere.
Well, okay. So talking about Anne, Oxford always claimed that his Achilles heel was that he was truthful, and that he was not the father of Anne's oldest daughter, another Elizabeth de Vere. I think I'd prefer to call her Eliza because we got, as you just said, it's 3 Elizabeths. It's a lot. He really didn't want to marry her. William Cecil, her father, talked him into it. If you all want to see how that happened, take a look at Act 2, Scene 5 in Pericles, where Simonides, who represents Cecil, kind of springs it on Pericles, who represents Oxford, first talking about what a great musician he is and that his daughter would like Pericles to be her music master. And then Simonides jumps into, what do you think of my daughter? Is she not virtuous? Why, yes, sir. Is she not fair? Why, yes, sir. My daughter thinks highly of you. And look at this letter. There's a letter in which the daughter Thesia declares that she loves Pericles, and Pericles stops backing up like, whoa, 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 whoa. I didn't imagine I was good enough for your daughter.
What's very interesting is that scene is sort of mirror reflected in the pages of Hamlet, where Hamlet is questioning Polonius and says, have you a daughter?
Yeah.
Is she fair?
Yes.
And then
nice.
later on, he asks Ophelia, are you fair? Are you virtuous? So it's very interesting that there's this sort of mirror reflection scene there that is the exact opposite. Also, however, though, surrounding a letter, only it's Hamlet's letter to Ophelia that Polonius brings to Claudius and Gertrude as proof that Hamlet's madness is based on his love for Ophelia.
Very nice, Stephen. Very, very nice. Well, the first letter that we see, the first true document, a historical document that we see about this engagement, is written to the Earl of Rutland, who's a childhood friend of Oxford's. by the Earl of St. John. And he says, you're not going to believe it, but the Earl of Oxford hath caught himself a wife, or more correctly, she hath caught him. There's much wailing and unhappiness among the court ladies. And then there's a letter that follows a month later to Rutland from Cecil himself, ever one to make sure that posterity sees the Cecil family in the best possible light. He writes that it was Oxford who wanted to marry Anne. And of course, he as the father thought she was too young, but he's such an important earl, I couldn't refuse him. So we can start to look at what happens next to see who's right. Was Oxford
and
pursuing?
She's how old at this point?
She's
old
15.
Is
she's
the
15. She's 15.
15-year-old girl.
Yeah, she's 15. So the wedding on the first time around is supposed to occur in September of 1571 at the Cecil's country estate, Theobald's, and the Queen is there. The entire court is there. William Cecil is so proud of this moment where his daughter is going to become Lady Oxford that he writes a congratulatory poem, which gets published in a Broad Street, distributed everywhere about the Queen and the marriage. And then a very funny thing happens. Everybody goes home rather suddenly because the wedding doesn't take place. So we can imagine that our groom either didn't want to show or wouldn't say the words "I do" because he did not want to marry the young lady.
Maybe he just got super drunk.
Maybe.
And was so hungover. He was so hungover he couldn't show up for the wedding. His bachelor party got out of control and he was so hungover. Now, one of the things that you mentioned, though, I think is interesting, too. You said that the letter from the Earl of St. John to the Earl of Rutland mentions that there's all kinds of wailing going on among the ladies
many.
in waiting.
Yeah, he apparently... desirable
he must have
guy,
been, quite the ladies' man, huh? All of the girls had their eye on Oxford. And I know something that we've talked about before is a lot of these ladies in waiting became ladies in waiting because they hoped to find themselves a noble husband.
That's the whole reason for coming to court.
Access to these gentlemen of nobility in the hopes, kind of like, remember that old movie, Officer and a Gentleman? Where the female protagonists are like hanging out around the officer candidate school with hopes that they'll find themselves an officer to marry.
There we go.
It's kind of similar to that structure, isn't it?
Yep. Well, that's where you're gonna find your spouses at court. So anyway, there's effort number 2, January 1573. December 1571. My mistake. The wedding takes place at Whitehall with 2 other couples. So they're making sure Oxford marries her this time. There's a big party at the Cecil's house on the Strand.
They're making sure that there's going to be a wedding at least. At
least a wedding.
Right? Like, we're going to gather all these people. We're going to have this big feast. We're going to make sure there's at least one wedding by scheduling 3 on top of each other. That way, nobody's here for no reason.
That's right. So... what do we have from the historical record after that? We have Oxford entertaining the Queen at Havering Bower, which is his house in the country, which went to her when he was 12 as part of the becoming her ward. She held these properties because he was going to owe her a bunch of money when he reached his 21st birthday. Mm-hmm. There's something about this house. He begs her for it, stamps his foot about it for his entire adulthood until she dies, and she never gives it to him. But James does. In January of 1573,
she was such a wicked control freak, right?
That's what I said. She controls him his entire life.
What was it to her? I mean, all these properties, what was it to her? But because he wanted it so badly, that's why she wouldn't give it to him.
Or there was something about it she didn't want him to have. Yeah, I think.
Yeah, every single bit of research I do, every episode that we record, I dislike this woman more and more and more as time goes on.
Well, she's not kind to Oxford. That's true. But on the other hand, I think that if we imagined her as a king who has to rule a country, she does what she has to do.
I'm not judging her for her. Like, obviously, you know, I say this quite often. I think that she's the most powerful woman to have ever lived. And I have a lot of reasons why I feel that way. And I would challenge anyone to argue with me about it, but that's a different episode. But I do. So I'm able to compartmentalize and separate her ability as a leader of a nation and the obligations of that and what she had to go through, especially with things like plague and the threat of Spanish invasion, and a pope that basically said, if you kill her, I'll absolve you from murder. Like, you know, there are a lot of extreme situations there, and I get that. But she's also, in her personal interactions with her courtiers, quite often very mean and cruel.
She is. There is no doubt about it. I agree with you. So anyway, Oxford and she make these trips, 5 of them actually, to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Matthew Parker, starting in January of 1573. And Oxford is not living with his wife. He hasn't been. He's been renting rooms from Thomas Twine. He's at the Savoy. The whole university wits are beginning to gather around him there. And Anne is being sent off to the country. And she complains to her father in a letter. Not only that, there are rumors everywhere, including people writing that Burleigh is winking at the affair that Oxford is having with the Queen, but he is also sending his men to spy to see how many times they visit. There's a wonderful tattletale named Gilbert Talbot who writes these letters that tells you what's really going on. And he writes, not only does the Queen delighteth more in Oxford than any other man, Gilbert writes that Mildred Cecil, Anne's mother, is unwisely declared that she objects to the Queen's relationship with her son-in-law, and the Queen has heard of it. So we have a wild set of rumors going, including one from Mary Queen of Scots, who writes her cousin, that says, everyone says the Earl of Oxford is not sleeping with his wife because he is afraid of losing the favors he may gain being your lover. So,
wow. Is that a direct quote?
Yeah.
Oh,
so
my.
Anne,
So this reaches all the way to Scotland, these quote unquote rumors, right?
Even
of
I know about it in Scotland. Poor
this
Anne.
love triangle.
Oh, come on. Let's poor Anne. We do have to pity her, right? She's 15 or 16 years old. She's being kept away from court. Everybody knows she hasn't consummated her marriage. She is that definition of virgin, which is a married woman who has not yet had sexual intercourse, right? That still makes her a virgin. So being the opposite of the Queen, who is an unmarried woman who has had sexual intercourse, they can both be defined as virgin. The virgin means both things. Anyway, in September, Burleigh's had enough. He has a party at Theobald's. He invites everybody. Oxford has to take Anne. By this time, it appears the affair with the Queen is over. We'll look into that timing when we get to the Queen. And Anne asks the Lord Chamberlain, Sussex, could I please have larger rooms when we get to Hampton Court, because maybe my husband will come to me again. This is heartbreaking stuff.
Yeah.
In mid-October. Yeah. In mid-October at Hampton Court, Oxford, angry in every way at the Queen not responding to him, turns to her in front of the entire court and says, if my wife is pregnant, it's not by me. So somebody hears that. Everybody hears that. And I started thinking, Oxford is so truthful. When he says Eliza de Vere is not his child, what if he's really right? Who would then be her father? And I started thinking about the 2 enormous Titian canvases that are reflected in the 2 long poems. The first works.
Okay, so the Titian canvases, you're talking about the famous paintings in Italy.
That's right, in Venice.
That are mentioned
in Titian's studio. In 1575, yeah.
Right, and we know because you took your husband in the previous episode that you were featured on. You took your husband to Italy to explore some of this stuff. So, but for our listeners who are going, Titian, what? There's tissue? Wait a minute. There is tissue. There's some really good tissue here that holds all of this together, and it is these canvases.
Yeah,
pardon the pun. That reflect that are these two beautiful paintings that are reflected in the two original poems published first under the name William Shakespeare. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yes,
and that's
exactly
Venus and Adonis. And the big connection with Venus and Adonis is that bonnet that Adonis is wearing in the painting that is referenced in the poem, and it's the only version of that painting that exists, so it had to have been seen by the writer. And then there's the Rape of Lucrece, which big part of the Rape of Lucrece describes that painting.
Yes, it does.
Almost like word for word description.
We can talk about those details. You need to ask, who would tie a brutal rape of a virtuous wife by her husband's comrades to an 18-year-old guy who is Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton? Why? I mean, both of these poems actually are kind of strange topics to dedicate to a young man. In Rape of Lucrece, when we look at the text, the Roman knife, it's just a short sword. It's neither a knife nor a sword. It's kind of in between, is described as being held by Tarquin. And the name of the painting is Tarquinius and Lucrezia, what Titian produced. But it is reflected in the painting, The Rape of Lucrece. He holds it over her. There's this male servant that's peeking in around the corner as the rape is about to take place. That is also in the poem. She is blonde, because, of course, all Venetian ladies got their hair bleached in the sun with lemon juice. They were blondes. And there is the Lucrece in the poem is blonde. She is very red-cheeked, both in the painting and in the poem. She has a dimple in her chin. And there's a lot of emphasis in the painting on her pale skin and these blue veins. And when you look at the painting, you look at her arm, which is raised up. It's her right arm. And Titian has put the shadows in on it, all in blue. Tarquin even has curly hair in both the painting and in the poem. And the poem is truly a revenge poem. It is something that the poet feels very strongly about. The bard is so obsessed with the story of this rape that he refers to it in Titus Andronicus, Taming of the Shrew, Twelfth Night, Macbeth, and Cymbeline. It's very focused on the effect of this rape on the husband and the children. I just pulled a couple of really short quotes just because it's so long, but to help listeners see it. So they, surviving husband, shall remain the scornful mark upon every open eye. And Tarquin says to Lucrece as he's forcing her, he goes, "If thou yield, I will rest thy secret friend. The fault unknown is a thought unacted. Then for thy husband and thy children's sake, tender my suit. Bequeath not their lot to the shame that from them no device can take."
Right. I mean, he's such an evil villain that here he is saying to her, and it's very much sort of like Angelo in Measure for Measure as well, right? Where he wants to have Isabella. And he says, well, if you keep it a secret, I'll keep it a secret, and then no one will suffer.
Exactly. And I believe those words were actually spoken to Anne Cecil. And I'm sure some of our listeners are going, wow, or I don't believe you. So let's take a look at what we have in terms of historical documents to back up this assertion that Anne Cecil was raped. And by the way, Oxford knew it had happened. There's a letter, December 7th, 1574, from a wonderful witness, the then Secretary of State, Thomas Smith, who was a close friend of the Cecils. He writes, Mildred Cecil from Hampton Court about a distillation given my lord for my lady Oxford, a water for the stomach. Apparently Mildred is very concerned, and Smith tells her that it's organic, but yes, it does contain abortives. It contains fennel and angelica water, which, if life were in the body, if she were pregnant, will not harm her, but will cause her menses to recommence, right? So pausing there for just a moment because we're going to continue with this letter in just a second.
He gave her a morning after pill. Is that what you're telling me?
Distillation. But wait,
Thomas
he
Smith
didn't
creates
give it.
a morning after pill.
Stephen, it's not that he gave it to her. It's that Thomas Smith gave it to Oxford to give to her.
And
which means
the mother, Mildred, her mother is concerned that it may harm her, that it may hurt her daughter.
But the point is, Anne and Oxford are both wanting to terminate this pregnancy. And everyone needs to think why an earl whose wife may be carrying his male heir. I mean, the daughter would be okay, but the male heir to the Oxford earldom may be inside of her, and yet they are terminating it. Anne is frantic. She wants to terminate this pregnancy.
Wow, that's some incredible research there, Dorothea.
Why would he do that?
That changes the dynamic in so many ways, including the Rape of Lucrece being published, and suddenly this strong reason why.
Very much so. And so if you want to go just a little further in the letter with me, Smith says, I can say no more. He's been sworn to secrecy. But I would be sorry that Lady Oxford should miscarry as if she were 5 times my daughter. So the only reason I can think of that Anne and Oxford would want to terminate that pregnancy would be because they both know it's not his child. Right?
Wow, there's some revelations going on right there. Wow, this, this portion of the story, what a great film this would make. Oxford first refusing to marry her, then being forced to marry her, then refusing to consummate and be with her while he's having this affair with the Queen. That finally comes to an end, and he's now being involved with his wife, but still won't sleep with her. She's pregnant because she's been raped by another man, and they're trying to figure out how to get rid of the baby. Like, this is some good late night soap opera stuff happening.
And it's all true, right?
Yeah, history, man. History is incredible, isn't it?
Yep. So what other proof do we have? You're going to go, okay, Dorothea, maybe. All right. So in December, Oxford is preparing to go abroad for his trip to France and Italy, sanctioned by the Queen. And he writes his will, what's going to happen to his property should he not return. And guess who he leaves it to? All of it. It's not Anne, who could be pregnant with his heir. Oh, no. He leaves it all to his sister, Mary.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So we have these 2 poems, which, visually are very similar to these 2 paintings. And we're going to think about why it is that these 2 come together. These 2 are really, truly a pair. You can't separate these poems one from the other. One goes to explain the Queen as Venus, and she's called Venus all the time. Everyone praises her beauty endlessly. She's fair, endlessly fair. As Olivia,
Venus, Diana, interchangeable.
On. Yes, she's this older woman seducing this young man who's only interested in the hunt, and she gets her right. The horses are off having their little, horse encounter, and Venus and Adonis goes through 9 editions because everybody is reading it, and it really goes to explain how Southampton is conceived. Just as the Rape of Lucrece explains how Eliza de Vere is conceived and why that is important.
You just went there, didn't you?
I did, yeah. Which is because in 1593 and 1594, Burleigh is encouraging the Earl of Southampton to marry his granddaughter, Eliza de Vere, and somebody needs to explain why this is not incest. And so these 2 long poems dedicated to this young man come out very publicly to explain, no, you guys are not half-siblings. This is not incest. And here is why.
Okay, that's an entirely separate episode, and I can't wait to dive into that more in detail, and also to ask some of our previous guests who are, strong proponents of what is known as the PT theory, the Prince Tudor theory. This would be Prince Tudor II, meaning the Earl of Southampton could possibly be the son of de Vere and Queen Elizabeth. But that if we go deeper into that right now, that's going to take us off our major love topic. But I love that idea. No one's ever put that forward that I can think of, and I can't wait to talk to some of our other previous guests like Hank Whittemore and Catherine Children and others who have talked about this theory at length and have published great works about this, to see how they feel about that aspect of it. Because when you tie all of that together, that starts to paint a totally, pardon the pun, totally different painting, totally different picture there.
Yeah, it does.
But it also would explain some of the issues that go on between Oxford and his wife, the years of estrangement, de Vere's refusal to acknowledge Elizabeth as his daughter, until she's this sweet little girl of 5 years old. And I'm thinking that maybe that's when, who can resist the cute little 5-year-old face that says, "Daddy, why don't you love me?"
Yeah, but it also goes on. I mean, this also explains why in those letters that Oxford writes back to Cecil, the ones that Cecil keeps, where he gets the news that Anne is pregnant, it's always bothered me, Stephen, that he's been very calm in that letter. When with his response, "Oh, your wife is pregnant," and I've read it, he's so calm. This explains why, because he already knew she was pregnant, and he left hoping the abortives would do their job and he wouldn't have to deal with this issue until he came back. In that letter, he writes, "Now that I have a son of my own, as I hope it is." So he's already laying the groundwork that in case she gets through the pregnancy and actually delivers, that child may not be his. Mm-hmm. And in the second letter, where he gets the news that a girl child has been delivered 9 months after the October incident, he sends a New Testament to Anne in Greek, because she reads Greek, as does he, and the Latin, an enigmatic dedication to her. It's very, very, very heavily laden. But if you know that they both know the child is not his, and he is still blaming her, which of course he shouldn't, but he does, because it's his honor, then when he says, "You're mother of a true daughter, hope to deliver a true son, make sure you always tell the truth and essentially use this testament to guide your soul," it becomes much clearer. It also becomes clearer when he's coming back from Italy. He comes back through Paris, and one of his servants meets him in Paris and tells him that his cousin, who is a horrible rumor monger, telling all sorts of slanderous rumors about Oxford over and over, Henry Howard, he's spreading rumors that the child Anne has delivered is not Oxford's. Now, Howard either knows that because he is the rapist, or he knows that because he knows who the rapist is.
And I'm certain that you have some strong theories as to who the rapist is, but again, that will take us into a whole nother episode.
It will. So let's just wrap this one up. In Christmas of 1581, he and Anne do get back together again. This is after Southampton has ended up at Cecil House because the second Earl of Southampton dies, and therefore he is also a ward to the Queen and being educated by Burleigh. And Oxford's explosive relationship with Lady Number 3, Anne Vavasor, has ended badly. He and Anne are reunited. They have 4 more children together, only 2 of whom survive, including boy. And when she dies in Greenwich in 1588, during the Spanish Armada, everybody is completely shocked. No one expected her to die. She dies of a fever. Her father constructs for her this extraordinary tomb, which you can go and see in Westminster Abbey, with this long epitaph that reads, "She was completely innocent and a very faithful wife," which, if she was raped, is a true statement. Mm-hmm. But Oxford's monument to her, Oxford's Valentine's to her, is this perpetual realization, after she's dead probably, that he really wronged her, that this was not her fault. And in the power of the poem Lucrece, you can see that he has fully realized from the woman's point of view what an unbearable dishonor and humiliating situation that was. And so he kills her off and resurrects her as Hero in Much Ado About Nothing.
Falsely accused, wrongfully accused.
Exactly. Hero, Leonatus' short daughter, and Anne Cecil was short, as was her father. Phaesia in Pericles. Hermione in Winter's Tale, that beautiful statue that comes to life after her husband, accuses her of becoming the lover of his best friend, and that their child is not his child. Helena in Measure for Measure, and ultimately Lucrece.
Helena in All's Well That Ends Well, you mean?
Excuse me, All's Well That Ends Well, yes.
And Isabella, the chaste Isabella in Measure for Measure.
Yes, indeed. So you can see how sorry he is. So don't hate him for being a young man and having his pride stand in the way. Appreciate that over time he came to realize Anne's worth.
Well, and the circumstances of having this totalitarian monarch who is also your lover, who has an affinity for you and your fine leg for dancing, et cetera, and knowing how viciously jealous she can be adds another layer to it that, needs to be considered in talk about riding a fine razor blade line as far as the political dangers that could be involved there if he shows too much affection to this wife. And ironically, that's one of the few marriages that Elizabeth not only approved of that occurred at court, but it appears actually supported and pushed for. And you have to wonder if she didn't want this marriage because she knew Anne Cecil was so young that Oxford did consider her to be more like a sister than a lover. And so she wouldn't be threatened by this other woman in Oxford's life in any way, which is why, and now going to the next Valentine, she hits the ceiling when he runs off with Anne Vavasour and goes nuts and throws them all in the tower. Him, her, and the baby, all three. Boom, get in the tower.
She absolutely does, and I think it bears saying that the true love of Elizabeth's life was Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. There is no doubt that he was the man for her. Dudley pushes more than his wife, Amy, down the stairs, when he finally figured out she wasn't going to marry him. He has lots of affairs, resulting in several sons named Robert, and she gets furious with him, alternatively banishing him from court and then taking him back. And the affair with Oxford clearly happens during one of these banishments when she's completely furious and finds out he's been seeing other women and having kids with them. So it's kind of almost like she uses Oxford in order to get Dudley back, because when she decides the affair of Oxford is over, it's over.
Yeah, that's very clear. And but yet she still has that, well, I don't want you, but I don't want anyone else to have you either kind of attitude, right? Like that's a sort of a thing that happens in some of the love triangles of the world, right? And I mean, I've even been the victim of that where, I had a relationship with someone and that relationship didn't work out. But then when I found someone new, that person was all upset and jealous, even though they didn't want me. They just didn't want me to have someone else, especially if they didn't have someone else yet. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, you know what? We're not going to discuss what I know you've discussed with Hank in detail. And Hank Whittemore does a beautiful job of explaining how Elizabeth kept herself away from court for almost 4 months, and then meets up with her progress in Bath, and how the sonnets very eloquently describe how Oxford is a very unhappy guest there that cannot be cured of what's wrong. Elizabeth, let us just, make the list together of every place that she shows up in the canon. No, let's just do the best. I'll give you my list and you can give me yours. She is the one person to whom the canon is written. He uses it to try to influence and talk to her for the rest of his life, he's probably in love with her on some level, even though she is very cruel and mercenary towards him. She's Helen of Troy, Titania in Midsummer Night's Dream with that little boy whom she adopts that Oberon wants so badly. She's Olivia in Twelfth Night, who is wooed but won't have anyone, especially not the clownish Malvolio, Sir Christopher Hatton in his cross-gartered. She's even Richard II in Richard II, and she says so. Venus in Venus at Adonis, the Phoenix in the Phoenix and the Turtle, the Dark Lady of the Sonnet. I mean, we could go on and on.
And, you know,
and on.
So again, I would put this layer on it, because I was about to ask you, do you think he really loved her? And I answered my own question in my mind in that, yes, he did, and in various different ways and at various different levels, including as a loyal subject to his prince.
Yes.
And I think that is a layer of love, especially in someone like Oxford, who I believe in many ways was a traditional feudalist, and, you know, being also of the longest standing title in all of England, thus the 17th Earl of Oxford, whereas opposed to Southampton, as an example, was only the 3rd Earl of Southampton. 17 generations spans centuries of time. I don't think a lot of people understand that. And the Earl of Oxford is second only to the crown in its age of title, dating all the way back to William the Conqueror. And so I think there is an element of that in him. I think it shows in the plays. I think it's demonstrated through many of the characters that there's this loyalist feeling. I think the history plays as the greatest propaganda work in the history of propaganda marketing demonstrates that loyalist to the crown attitude in so many ways. And so I think that there's a layer of love for her that comes through that as much as it would come through her being a woman, him being attracted to her, them sharing, I think, incredibly, I think their minds. I think theirs was an extreme love affair of the mind. I think they were both brilliant and they loved each other for their brilliance as well.
I totally agree with you, but she does use him. And as I said, she's the queen. She gets to. But shall we move on?
She could chop off his head if she wants to, too. So, you know, like there's always that, you know, like I think there's that. That's another layer that we just have to constantly remember is that she has the power of life and death in her hand at all times for everyone and anyone. And I don't think in modern times we're able to really wrap our heads around what that means. That kind of true totalitarian power of a snap of a finger and you're gone forever. I think that's a layer that we always have to keep in mind when we're talking about this era of history.
Yes, we do. So shall we talk about the femme fatale?
Yeah, let's talk about her because by all accounts, she was a hot number and there were a lot of people wanted her. Yeah, she was not, everyone wanted her to be a Valentine.
So Anne shows up in court at 19 in 1579. She's 10 years younger than Oxford. And she is Anne Cecil's opposite. She's tall. She's attractive. She's poetic. She is ambitious. She has a quick wit. She's fast on the retorts. She's really rebellious, and this woman loves courting danger. I imagine that she sees this high-ranking earl who used to be the queen's personal property. He's separated from his plain, short wife, and she decides, I want that one. She goes for him. He falls head over heels, madly in love with her. Troilus and Cressida is the play that reflects their relationship, both with its happy and unhappy aspects. And Troilus says he hides his sighs in the wrinkles of a smile, but he is mad for Cressida's love. Mm-hmm. So Oxford talks as Troilus. He talks about stalking in front of her door, and that he is, completely out of his mind for her. She's in court because her uncle, brings her to court, and she ends up as a maid of honor in the bedchamber, thanks to Uncle Knivet, and provides, I think, a great source of court gossip for Oxford, who is in high writing mode. The affair is on probably the summer of 1579. By Christmas of that year, his evil cousin, Lord Howard, claims that his plan is to carry Nan overseas and marry her. May or may not be true. It's coming from Howard. We, have a big caveat with whatever he says, but it does indicate that Oxford is possessed. The Queen's all distracted by Leicester with Lettice, Devereux, and the French marriage. And Oxford, through Troilus, writes, "Her eyes, her hair, her cheek, her gait, I am weaker than a woman's tears, tamer than sleep." So he pursues.
That's quite a Valentine. You know what?
Isn't that quite a Valentine? That's quite.
Don't tell my wife. I'm going to pull open my pages. I'm going to write that in her Valentine's card and slip it to her while we're having our Valentine's dinner. There we go. That's beautiful.
Don't this won't air until after you've had a chance to do that.
That's right. But she listens to every episode though, so I think I just blew my cover.
So anyway, Oxford is during this time that he's seeing Anne. He purchases Bishop's Folly, that huge house outside of Bishopsgate, right across from the Bedlam Hospital, the Insane, with all of those outbuildings and the gardens. And he's got his crew of writers and musicians there, Kidd and Lodge and Nash and Lilly and Munday and Watson. And probably he saw a lot of Anne there. I don't have any evidence of that, but they like to trade insults. And if you want to hear them trading insults, clue in to Beatrice and Benedict in Much Ado About Nothing for that quick wit and repartee that here's this frolic of wordplay that these two people are capable of. My favorite scene is when they are dancing together masked, and she knows who he is behind the mask, but he thinks she doesn't. And she just, she tells him Benedict's an idiot. I mean, that's what she does. And he has to stand there and take it.
One of the things I think that is one of the most perfect pieces of dramatic literature ever written. Much Ado About Nothing is perhaps the most perfect play. It has everything you could ever want in a play: the rich characters, the dramatic moments, the hilarious comedy, the happy ending. It's a beautiful, wonderful play, and they're tricked into loving each other. I mean, how great is that? By their friends, or to admitting that they love each other. And at the end, when Benedict just turns to her and says, "Peace, I will stop your mouth," and kisses her to keep her from saying anything more against him. It's a wonderful moment, and
it's brilliant.
I'm sitting here listening to you talk about Anne Vavasour and how she came to court and her personality traits, and it's pretty incredible that she didn't lose her head, considering the sequence and story of her life. And I'm wondering if one of the reasons she did not lose her head is, if you think about it, she is so reflective of the Queen's mother, Anne Boleyn, that it's uncanny. The same situation of the uncle that brought her to court to use her for political gain, and did basically dangle her in front of the king at the time. So here's Thomas Knivet dangling Anne Vavasour in front of these courtiers, trying to gain political advantage through her.
He is panderer.
Right? He is.
He's a panderer. Right. That's what he is. That's where the name comes from in Troilus and Cressida.
Right, panderess.
Of that uncle character.
Exactly. And if you think about it, it is so reflective of the story of Anne Boleyn, and the Queen is not... the Queen is obviously cognizant of her mother's history and her mother's story. And I'm wondering if she didn't see a little bit of that in this lady in waiting, this lady of her bedchamber, and thus have a little bit of an affinity for her beyond what she might feel otherwise. And that probably helped Anne in some ways. That's theorizing, of course, but the similarities are historically true.
Yep. And just to make sure everybody is caught up, things go sour very quickly because Anne is very clever at concealing a pregnancy until she swells past hiding. the bard says in Troilus, and gives birth in March of 1581 to a son named Henry Vere, who is acknowledged by Oxford, in contrast to not acknowledging Eliza de Vere. Right. He does acknowledge and support this son. Another place as well, you could listen to Rosaline and Barone in Love's Labour's Lost. You'll hear the same back and forth that you hear in Much Ado About Nothing. But when things go bad, they go bad quickly. And I would just like to point out, as things are going down the drain, Lady Number 4 appears in court, another dark-haired beauty at the age of 18, Elizabeth Trentham, who watches this whole mess implode, and it really implodes. As you indicated, Oxford gets thrown into the Tower, and then he's under house arrest, and he's not allowed back in court until June of 1583. She, immediately after being released from prison with the child, starts to defame Oxford. She claims he seduced her, just like Cressida does. Troilus, unlike Troilus, he doesn't see it coming. He is still in love with her. The words of the play say, this was this quick goodbye, be thou true, and I will see thee. But she doesn't. And Troilus says, never did a young man fancy with so external and so fixed a soul. She takes up.
She has no choice. She has to save herself. He's not going to marry her. She knows that he can't marry her. It was all fun and games until she got pregnant and had a baby, and now she's got to figure out, how am I going to find a man who is going to still want to marry me and take this other man's child to be his own, which in today's day and age is not such a big deal and happens all the time. Step parents are all over the place, but back then it was a whole different story. And so
it was a different
story. I don't see how he could have been foolish as to think, what else was she going to do? What other choice did she have? But
Stephen, when you're that much in love, the brain doesn't think logically. And he really loved her, and she shattered him. Absolutely shattered him.
I don't have any sympathy for him on that one, I have to say.
Maybe not. She goes on to a very colorful life. She marries a sea captain, and later, while still married to the sea captain, she marries another guy.
Ooh.
Gets convicted of bigamy. Yeah, she's quite a life. And Anne dies in Paris in 1650 at age 90. She is possibly the oldest person who really knew the truth about Shakespeare.
Oh, man, there's another whole movie to be made just about her life. What a rich, full, incredible life she must have had. And what a great film to be making right now, too, in this age of women and women of power and influence. And wow, I'll bet she's a magnificent feminist character that would make a fabulous story.
She is absolutely
sexually liberated. She's got two husbands, dual lives going on later in life, living it up in Paris until the age of 90. Like, wow, yeah, that's an incredible. Okay, I'm gonna do a little more research into her and see if there are any really good, solid biographies written about her, because she's an incredible lady. No wonder why he was so intrigued with her and fell so head over heels for her. But still, what a dope. Like, dude, you had to think it couldn't go anywhere. It had a sunset date no matter what.
Well, this takes us basically melding these storylines together to 1588 when Anne Cecil dies and Oxford is melancholy, depressed, impoverished. His daughters go off to Burleigh. Life is a very, very half-empty glass of water at this point. And then 1589 occurs, and we meet Lady Number 4, Elizabeth Trentham. For all the fuss over Anne Cecil, one of the objections Oxford had to marrying her was that she was a commoner and that it wasn't fair to ask him as a member of the nobility. So her father, William Cecil, seizes on that and says, great, you queen, will you please ennoble my family? So Elizabeth's father was an esquire. She was not a member of the nobility. She was Mistress Elizabeth. She was not Lady Elizabeth. And although she had $1,000 mentioned by her father as her dowry, that's not a nothing but it's certainly not a huge amount of wealth. A lot of descriptions of her said she was rich. She wasn't rich. She was solidly upper middle class. So he doesn't let either of these stand in the way.
Suddenly it doesn't matter anymore. Suddenly, what was it, 20 years later, and it doesn't really matter that she's not nobility. What we find is that was just an excuse, just a ruse for Oxford to use to try to not marry Anne Cecil. And I believe that the true reason he did not want to marry Anne was because he saw her as this little sister and he wasn't sexually attracted to her. And
he didn't want to be under her father's control.
Sure.
Either.
And in the beginning, I mean, they ended up having how many children together? So obviously he got over the issue of not being sexually attracted to her. And the guy has 7 children altogether between the various different women. So he's definitely somewhat of a ladies' man. There's no doubt about that. But I think that's part of the issue, right? Is when you do have that kind of a libido, you definitely don't want to be spending time with somebody who doesn't ignite you in bed.
No, and whose father is probably going to keep you under his thumb pretty clearly. The combo, I think. So anyway, Elizabeth, interestingly, she's very close to her older brother Francis and one of her sisters, Catherine, who interestingly has a daughter named Cordelia. So Oxford there's sort of a shade of this in the plays that he may have tried to get back together, talk Queen Elizabeth into marrying him after Anne's death. But at any rate, it doesn't work. She rejects him again if he asks. And then we get to March of 1591. And one Julia Penn pleads with Oxford for payment of overdue rent. And she says she considered contacting Elizabeth Trenton to settle it, but decided not to because I know your lordship's pleasure. So, oh, wow, Stephen, how long has this been going on? Right? There's the romance right there.
If the landlady says, I know who you've been sleeping with, and she might be willing to pay your debts for you, that's pretty outward knowledge then that there's an affair going on there.
Well, I don't think it's an affair. And I'll tell you why. Because Elizabeth's reputation is that though she's been the Queen's maid of honor for 10 years, and she's had a lot of offers of affairs and marriage, she has turned them all down. All of them. I begin to wonder if she wasn't waiting for someone in particular. And the reason I also think they didn't sleep together before they were married is because they don't get married between March of 1591, when this landlady knows about it. They don't get married till December of 1591. And what is going on? Well, what is going on is the remarkable Elizabeth Trentham, who has, I would say she is a Tudor version of a modern JD MBA with a specialty in commercial real estate and bankruptcy.
Oh, are you saying that you see some similarities between she and some podcast guest that I might know?
Yeah, let's see what she does, shall we? Let's look at the facts and see what she does. Pieces of Oxford's real estate that he still owns, and he owns more than you think, start being moved one by one between March and their wedding date into the names of Elizabeth, her brother, and a lawyer named John Woley, one by one, as if Elizabeth is going, I'll marry you, but I don't want to become involved in your financial disaster, and I don't want my dowry to go to pay your debtors. So if you want to marry me, all the land has to be moved. He even moves a piece of land he owns, a very profitable piece of land called the Great Garden Property at Aldgate, into her name 6 months before he weds her. So he trusts her absolutely.
That's quite a prenup. That is awesome prenuptial agreement going on right there, right?
He really wants her and he really trusts her. So Elizabeth's father dies and leaves a will in which he says, if my daughter is not married within 4 years of when I die, she gets her dowry outright. That's a fairly incredible thing. What's even more incredible is that while he makes her older brother, Francis, his executor, he says if Francis is unable to perform or dies, Then my daughter Elizabeth is my executor. She's in her 20s. Who makes their 20-something-year-old daughter their second-level executor?
A man who
except
knows
for
how
a father.
brilliant his daughter is, and
His daughter is,
and how
that
capable
is.
she is, and how she is going to be the better choice. I mean, not always is the firstborn the better choice. That's part of the problem with this whole hierarchy aspect of these people is, wait a minute, but the firstborn's an idiot, or the eldest son is not nearly as capable as the eldest daughter, or whatever the case might be, right?
Right. And we have a lot of her letters, a fair number of them. And she writes in one of them that her whole duty in life is, and this is a quote from her, upholding and raising the ancient and most honorable house of Oxenford with what in myself doth lie.
She's an angel. Wow, what a miracle.
She
what a
is.
miracle.
It's a world where men make all the financial decisions. They deal with all the real estate. They deal with the lawyers. They deal with lawsuits. They decide who marries who, and they deal with physical protection of a home. There's this great little story from a servant who recalls how after they're married and living in King's Place, Oxford's working, and this annoying guy that keeps trying to get money out of Oxford, he's sort of a trespasser, keeps showing up. And Oxford calls down to Elizabeth to get him out. I just love that image, that she's actually enforcing throwing the guy out so her husband can work upstairs. Something else that's remarkable about her is that she reduced the 14,752 pounds of debt that Oxford had owed the Court of Wards and the Crown since he was 12 years old for over 30 years. She reduces it to 20 pence.
That's
Oxford
like equivalent to reducing about $2 million in debt. Is that roughly?
I cannot say that I know what it is. I have heard that 1,000 pounds was roughly equivalent to $1 million, but I don't know myself. It's not something that I feel confident saying, but it's a large sum of money.
It's a giant sum of money.
And he dies debt free. This is for everyone who's always said that Oxford was such a spendthrift. He dies debt free. And the proof of that is that after he's dead, she beats back Robert Cecil, who's become treasurer, who erroneously claims that amounts were still owed the treasury from Oxford and his father's estate. And you watch her in her letter responding to him. She goes one by one by one. No, it's not because of this. No, it's not because of that. No, it's not because of this. And then we get to the 8 pounds of debt that Cecil claims she owes as Countess. And she says, I would be happy to pay it if you tell me where and when, but I want a written release from you because my name is not Anne, as you've written it. It is Elizabeth. Anne, of course, being Cecil's deceased sister and Oxford's first wife. She even takes down Sir Edward Coke, who is the greatest justice of the Elizabethan and Jacobean era. Law students today still read his opinions because, she says, he got a grant from King James for the stewardship of the manor of Havering at Bower after Oxford died that belonged to their son, the 18th Earl of Oxford, Henry, and that no king or queen in all the history of the Oxford family had ever given that away, and that was the start of the slippery slope of Henry being done out of his property, and Cook is required to give it back. The list goes on and on. We could talk about how she responds to the fraudsters who are out there. She gets the Queen to deed her King's Place in Hackney, which is this exquisite country mansion, where she gives Oxford not just his son, she gives him the time and the place for 12 years to rework those plays into the masterpieces.
Okay, so we're running out of time with this episode, and we've covered so much, and it's such a lot to cover. These four magnificent women who were the Valentines of Edward's life. But one of my takeaways from this episode today is we need to do another episode where we explore further those two epic poems Venus and Adonis and Rape of Lucrece and some of the deeper meanings that's involved there. That's an entirely interesting topic to move into and spend an hour on. And then now at the end here, I want to spend an hour talking about Elizabeth Trentham and the role she played further, not only in erasing these debts and in managing his life and his properties for him while he could work, the mad genius furiously writing, in my mind, that's the way I see it. You know, he always needed this manager, and she comes along later in his life. That's who she is. And they have this magnificent partnership that I've seen so many times. As an artist, I've seen it so many times that, you know, the mad genius artist needs to marry the rational, pragmatic type who helps keep them in check and keeps them directed and focused and manages the quote unquote mundane parts of life so that they can just feverishly do their craft and work on their art. And I'd like to explore that further in another episode, going into these questions. And I want you to think about these, and I hope our listeners will think about these and do some research on them too. Why doesn't she throw him some great funeral, this great manager, this money lady who obviously loved him so much? Why doesn't he have this great funeral? Why doesn't he get this magnificent burial? And how come we don't know where he is? That's a huge one. And how much of a role did she play in the publishing of these plays and in getting the first folio to happen, in recruiting her son-in-law, stepson-in-law, I suppose you would say, and her almost stepson-in-law, his brother, to help her? And where can we find any connection between her and Ben Jonson, if we can? Because that would be the next piece to the puzzle, I think. Don't you think?
I think that's terrific. I would just like to say the romance for her, if visitors are looking for where she is in the canon, we haven't talked about that, and I have a lot to say about this, but I won't. She is Viola in Twelfth Night, and their romance in this Viola who comes into Orsinio's life, where he is changeable and moody, and she is practical and comes forward with a plan and dresses as a boy and interacts with Olivia and takes messages back and forth, and ultimately he falls in love with her. Their romance is set forth there, and also in the poem he writes her, where her last name is written as the first letter of every line of the poem. So we can talk about that another time.
Nice.
As well.
And is she not also in Merchant of Venice then?
I would say we would be hard pressed not to see her.
Right. I mean, you know, this strong
legal mind. She knows the law. She's not a lawyer. Yeah. She is. I think there are shades of her also in Rosalind and As You Like It. Any of those plays where the woman dresses up as a man to do a man's role, but remains this warm, caring, just, funny, and ultimately very vulnerable.
And you mentioned that she refused how many suitors? Her father being dead, and the whole 4 years of marriage after his, she's not married 4 years after his death. I mean, all of that tends to reflect to the Portia situation in interesting ways as well. And then I would say there's a flip-flop here, because this is what he does so well in his writing. It's actually Elizabeth Trentham who chooses the lead box in marrying Oxford.
She does. She does. Because she knows, she has seen everything horrible in his life. And he puts that into her poem. That is one of the things he says in her poem, tried by the most approved truth, he says. You have seen me at my worst, and still you want me. And the final two lines of that poem, he says, she is more fair than she that was the fame of youth, which is, of course, Queen Elizabeth, except but one, the like was never seen. And so he's saying, I used to think Queen Elizabeth was the most amazing and beautiful woman, but now I know there is one more, and that's you.
What a fabulous love affair they must have had.
What a fabulous love affair. He gets it right the fourth time around.
and finally finds true, solid, partnering love in his life before dying. And it almost chokes me up, in fact, as we discuss it, because it's such a beautiful ending to such a tortured, struggling life. And as you well know, not to date you, but as you well know, that type of mature love is so much more true and real and genuine than the love of our youth. And I know I've experienced that in my own life and in my marriage to my wife now at an older age that I am. And I think that all of our listeners listening too, who have had those different experiences, the young love, the middle love, and then the mature love.
Yeah, the pragma is what the Greeks call it. They have a whole word for it, from which our word pragmatic comes. But it's exactly that. It's a great deal of, there's romance to start, but romance doesn't last forever. And if you don't replace it with something else, the relationship.
Amen to that. And I hope that our listeners have enjoyed this Valentine tribute episode, and I hope that they will find it to be a Valentine to them from you and I. On this wonderful episode, Dorothea. Thank you so much for joining us and bringing your research and explaining these women and their roles in the life of Edward de Vere and the Shakespearean canon.
Thank you, Stephen. I always enjoy talking with you.
We want to remind everyone listening that if you are not already a member of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, you can join the organization very easily from the website, shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org, shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org. I know you've all visited, and if you haven't clicked on join, you need to. Come become a member. Your dues help support the organization, programs like this podcast series and our other outreach efforts that we engage in as an organization to help spread the truth. Not only that, but you'll receive the quarterly newsletter, which is full of wonderful information, reviews of latest publications, as well as the research of some of the members. And you'll have access to contribute to that newsletter as well if you become a member. So please, if you will, consider joining the organization if you haven't already. I know that there are listeners out there who are not members because I know what our membership roles look like and I know what our listener numbers are. So there's at least half of you out there listening who have not joined yet, and we want you to please consider to do so. It also makes a great gift. Gift memberships are very reasonable. In fact, they're less expensive than a regular annual membership because it's designed to be a gift and to encourage others to join. So if you have somebody that you'd like to share something unique and interesting with, this is the great type of gift to give them. They'll start receiving the quarterly newsletter. They'll get access to information, and you can introduce others to this most excellent, greatest literary mystery of all time. Thank you for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. We're so glad to have you as our listeners. We'll see you again with the next episode. And until then, remember, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
Dragon Wagon.